sleep. Okay. Yes, Fat Boy needs to make his appearance. Hi. Hi, my little puppy doggy. My little puppers. My little pupperoni. My little pupperoni. Love you, pupperoni. You gotta let me read. You have to let me read. Okay, go. Go over there. Go. Go. Okay, we read the Buddha's contract. And we're going to start with this chapter, the unified message of ongoing guidance. Abraham, Jesus, Muhammad, and the Buddha shared an awakening process that is an archetypical journey. The progression they experienced as they moved into their enlightenment corresponds to the stages through which each one of us will pass at one time or another. For it appears that this is the way the journey is written. Even the small fragments of their histories presented here suggest quintessentially human profiles, rather than lives that needed no spiritual instruction, introspection, prayer, or self-discipline. And we can find similar profiles in the lives of more recent mystics, such as Hilda Charlton and Bernie Glassman. By comparing our own doubts, questions, fears, and reluctances with theirs, we can see that the archetypical roadmap created by their spiritual awakenings is already at work within us. We may not yet have progressed as far as they, but we are on the same path. They do not exist in some stratosphere impossibly high above us, beyond our reach. Each of these spiritual masters had a moment in which his soul was called forth, and the deeper significance of his life was revealed to him. Each in his own way required guidance and education, and each was brought to a series of surrender points, tested to see if his faith had become stronger than his need for earthly power. Upon completing these stages of spiritual awakening, they all maintained a profound spiritual practice while teaching those around them. Even after his enlightenment, for instance, the Buddha is said to have continued to meditate daily. Jesus and Muhammad also prayed up until the end of their lives. And Abraham ever performed the rituals of his nascent religious tradition. Our pathway, like theirs, has assignments and tests, each one part of a spiritual learning process that is meant to help us move through our illusions about the relative merit of external power and inner power. We need never feel either that we have too far to travel or that we have already arrived and can stop practicing the everyday virtues of compassion and mindfulness. There is one final and most important lesson to be gleaned from observing these lives. Along the way, each spiritual master has contracted to meet not only his most faithful disciples, but also those who would bring out his shadows and fears, the petty tyrants I mentioned earlier. Each had to experience resistance and betrayal. This is especially true in the case of Jesus, who was betrayed by one of his closest disciples, and Muhammad, who had to wage war against elements of Arabic society that wanted to stop Islam before it spread its radical social reforms. And there is evidence that even the Buddha, who lived in a relatively tranquil life of internet preaching, had a blind spot regarding the role of women in the spiritual order he sought to establish. He felt that women's sexuality represented a threat to celibacy and serenity to his monks, and that even if women devoted themselves to the same austere life, they would soon abandon it. So he initially resisted the idea of allowing women to form monastic orders. But his foster mother, Prajapati, who had cared for the Buddha when his own mother died shortly after giving birth, and Anananda, one of his closest disciples, argued the point with him, exposing the Buddha's shadow in this area. And they finally convinced him to accept women as nuns. The great religious leaders had to find their sacred contracts in order to overcome their own limitations, fears, and shadows. You and I may never become fully realized beings, at least in this lifetime, but all we actually need to do is to strive to realize our fullest divine potential. That may not be the same potential as that of the masters we've been studying. It may be less or even more, but it's our potential, and that's all that is expected of us. The lives of these four great spiritual masters provide a roadmap for charting the stages of your own spiritual transformation. In Chapter 6, we will look at another kind of map, one that charts the structure and flow of energy within our body and spirit through the centers of the psycho-spiritual energy known as the chakras. In Chapter 7, we will work yet another map in the form of cosmic wheel that helps you chart the significance of your personal team of archetypes. Together, these maps will allow you to interpret the meaning of your contract and see your life in entirely a new way. But before we go any further, we'll first need to explore the nature of archetypes and their role in your life. So that was a short chapter. I'm going to read a couple of these. Speaking your archetypes, your four principal energy companions. The mind, once enlightened, cannot become dark. Thomas Paine. Archetypes are your energy guides to your highest potential. The fulfillment of the 5 stages of your sacred contract. You have 4 constant archetypes at work in your life: the child, victim, prostitute, and saboteur. Now we'll work with these 4 universal archetypes. The child is among the most powerful patterns in our psyches because we are born into it. It is our first state of consciousness. Before Freud, the influence of childhood experiences on psychological and emotional well-being was rarely investigated. In the late 20th century, that attitude not only changed, it became extreme and even self-indulgent, in my opinion. Most Western societies now attribute adult behavior and motivations to the quality of an individual's childhood. Much blame for aberrant, immoral, or sociopathic actions is offloaded onto childhood resentments, sadness, and neglect. Judging from the people who have come to see me professionally, validating many people's views of their early experiences can provide a passageway to healing. But it has often led people to become stuck in their early wounds. The child actually has many aspects including the wounded or orphaned child, to which many people relate, and the magical or innocent child, among others. Engagement with the magical child is rare, but it's a pure delight to be in the company of someone who radiates that archetype. Sir George Trevelyan, who has been called the father of the New Age movement in England, was such a person. Educated in the old world tradition at Cambridge, George was the quintessential Victorian gentleman. Eccentric, deep-voiced, and captivatingly dramatic. Although his father had expected him to follow family tradition and pursue a career in academics, George was consumed early on by an interest in spirituality and alternative healing. His entire life was a mythic journey in which he explored the nature of human consciousness. He consciously lived in two realms, the physical and the spiritual. He spoke about having conversations with nature spirits and wind sprites, garden sprites and angels, making this type of inter-realm dialogue seem exactly what it should be, natural. Although I tend to be skeptical of people making such claims, I believed St. George because of his matter-of-fact attitude, selflessness, and innocence. He never demanded that others acknowledge what he described as his world. I met Sir George on New Year's Eve in 1982 at the Findhorn community in Scotland when he was in his early 70s. Thereafter, he and I presented several workshops together during the 1980s in different parts of England, and each one was an adventure into his alternate reality. One time he took me to a place that is believed to be the mythical home of Camelot and Avalon, and he spoke about the Knights of the Round Table as if he knew them on a first-name basis. And by this time in our relationship, I would have believed he did. The most memorable scene in which George's magical child stepped into action took place in 1986 at a workshop we did in classic English manor house. As we were lecturing to a group of people, George suddenly stopped speaking and focused his attention on the back of the room. I hesitated for a moment, and then, knowing that I might be opening us all for a real surprise, asked him, "What are you looking for?" "Why," he replied, "the god Pan has just decided to join us." Immediately everyone turned to the back of the room, but all they saw was the wall, not the mythic Greek god of the forest, half man, half goat, with cloven hooves and two horns on his head. "So what does he want?" I asked George. "He simply wants to join in on the fun." "Well, tell him he's welcome to stay with us for as long as he likes," I said. George laughed with delight and went back to teaching. I, on the other hand, kept staring at the back of the room, hoping that I could catch a glimpse of this god who had decided to honor us with his presence. I didn't see a thing, yet as I watched George inspire the group while reading them from his favorite poetry, I realized that I had made my own spiritual work too serious. Although the intense demands of my own spirit repeatedly affirm that I am in touch with another dimension, George showed me that the process of working with our spirits should be magical. This reminds me of my daughter Opal, who I no longer have access to, but she is a magical child. And I pray to God that that hasn't been taken from her. He helped many others open to their own personal gods and energy companions, allowing magic back into their lives. through his nightly enchanting views and teachings. That evening over dinner, I asked George how it was that he could see Pan and the spirits of the nature kingdom. "Oh, that's easy," he said. "I look through the imagination of my inner child. All children can see into that world when they are very young. The door between worlds closes as you get older and begin to believe that there is no such thing. For George, this archetype as an imaginative world had become a companion." Okay, I'm just going to read this one other one. In the beginning, Sir George was an extraordinary character, but his experience is not unique. Others throughout history have been aware of the living presence of archetypes. I'm sorry, I'm really sad this morning. My heart is with my children, who I no longer, one has been killed by the system and the other one I don't have access to, and there's just some days I wake up and I'm devastated over it. But I have to go on. Sir George was an extraordinary character, but his experience is not unique. Others throughout history have been aware of the living presence of archetypes and been comfortable discussing them and discoursing with them. In ancient Greece, Plato asserted the existence of archetypal ideas for forms as at the centerpiece of his philosophical view of the world. As the intellectual historian Richard Tarnas points out, Platonic forms are not conceptual abstractions that the human mind creates by generalizing from a class of particulars. Rather, they possess a quality of being, a degree of reality that is superior to that of the concrete world. Platonic archetypes form the world and also stand beyond it. They manifest themselves within time and yet are timeless. They continue the veiled essence of things. According to Tarnas, Plato often saw the gods and goddesses of Greek tradition as symbols of universal patterns of emotion. In his Symposium, for instance, Plato envisioned Eros, the Greek god of love, as a complex and multidimensional archetype which at the physical level expresses itself in the sexual instinct, but at the highest levels impels the philosopher's passion for intellectual beauty and wisdom, and culminates in the mystical vision of the eternal, the ultimate source of all beauty. As we have seen, the great Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, one of my favorites, was the first to define and explore extensively the nature and role of the universal archetype in human consciousness. By their very nature, Jung explained, archetypes have their origins in the dawn of human history. The psyche is not of today, he wrote. Its ancestry goes back many millions of years. Individual consciousness is not only the flower and the fruit of a season, sprung from the perennial rhizome beneath the earth. Jung tied archetypes inextricably to his concept of the collective unconscious, which is distinct from the individual unconscious. The collective unconscious is the inherited experience of the entire human race. Your consciousness is affected by this greater unconscious, and yours also makes a contribution to the collective. Echoing Plato, Jung defined archetypes as definite forms in the psyche that seem to present always and everywhere. Jung's best-known disciple, Joseph Campbell, who I also love, my father loved, wrote that since archetypes or norms of myth are common to the human species, they are inherently expressive of common human needs instincts, and potentials. When Jung propounded his theory of archetypes, he had been steeping himself in the mythological and folklore of the world, from the Egyptians, Babylonians, and Greeks to the Gnostics and American Indians. Just as some kind of analytical technique is needed to understand a dream, so a knowledge of mythology is needed in order to grasp the meaning of a content deriving from the deeper levels of the psyche. The collective unconscious, so far as we can say anything about it at all, appears to consist of mythological motifs and primordial images, for which reason the myths of all nations are its real exponents. In fact, the whole of mythology can be taken as a sort of projection of the collective unconscious. Volumes have since been written about archetypes. Clarissa Pinkola Estes, Jean Shendoa Bolin, Robert Bly, and many other authors have made immense contributions to this vast subject, drawing on an apparently limitless supply of myths and folk tales from disparate cultures around the globe. These writers have identified hundreds of archetypical patterns that have a significant effect on our daily lives and relationships. Their work implies that although archetypes are patterns of influence that are both ancient and universal, they become quite personalized when they are part of an individual's own psyche. Since your sacred contract is embodied in a support system of 12 archetypes, perhaps the most advantageous way to think of them is as intimate companions. I'm also in the middle of reading this book. I pick it up every once in a while because it's pretty dense. It's called The Ultimate Journey, and it's written by psychologists and doctors who did a study on people dying from cancer, and they gave them LSD, and of course supervised them. But in every case study, while the patients were high, all the patients individually remembered stories of mythology without ever knowing they knew them. But in their hallucinations, each one had stories of mythology, which is so fascinating to me. They wrote about something called a spiritual emergency that can happen even if you don't have an induced, like an LSD induced enlightenment. And that happened to me after my son was killed. I had something that I now understand was a spiritual emergency. And a lot of these archetypes and mythology stories came flooding to my mind without me even having any prior knowledge of them, which is fascinating. Okay, actually the nature of your archetype is both intimate and impersonal. Viewed through the heart, they are personal enough to be called companions. Viewed with the mind, they are impersonal, symbolic patterns that serve in the energetic organization of your spiritual evolution. As I say in my workshops, a personal experience filtered through an impersonal or symbolic attitude creates a vastly different psychic chemistry from taking everything personally. Just as your archetypes have a dual nature, you too have the constant challenge. Okay, hold on, stop. Of holding within yourself a personal heart and symbolic mind. Don't misinterpret this statement to mean that all relationships and life experiences will be simple and painless if you just treat your interactions impersonally and impassively. That, of course, is nonsense. What we need to do is make conscious choices that take responsibility for ourselves, including our thoughts and attitudes. Working with your archetypical patterns is the best way I know to become conscious of yourself, the effects of your actions, and the need for choosing wisely every day. Okay, let's read what our next archetype is from the appendix. We left off at destroyer. The next one is detective. Spy, double agent, sleuth, snoop, Sherlock Holmes, private investigator, profiler. See also warrior and crime fighter. Positive characteristics of the detective include the ability to seek out knowledge and information that supports solving crimes and protecting the public. Detectives combine great powers of observation with highly evolved intuition to deduce the solution to crimes. Whereas the detective is public and often highly respected, especially its modern counterpart, the police. Profiler, the empowered spy, is associated far more with the superstitious and often illegal acquisition of secret information regarding politics, business, or national security. Our attitude towards spies often depends on whose side they're on. Many Americans see Gary Powers as a heroic figure, while double agents such as Robert P. Hansen or British intelligence officer and Soviet spy Kim Philby are considered traitors. The shadow side of these archetypes can manifest as voyeurism, falsifying information, or selling out to the highest bidder. Parents who spy on their children with good intentions, such as uncovering their involvement with sex or drugs, are nonetheless flirting with the shadow detective. Films: Humphrey Bogart, The Maltese Falcon, and The Big Sleep. Richard Burton in The Spy Who Came from the Cold. Kelly McGillis and Jeff Daniels in The House on Carroll Street. Kathleen Turner in V.I. Warshawski. Lawrence Oliver in Sleuth. Any James Bond, Sherlock Holmes, or Charlie Chan film. Fiction: Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Dashiell Hammett, Agatha Christie, Rex Stout, Tom Clancy, John le Carré. Television: I Spy and Magnum P.I. Religion and myth: Sinon and Greek lore, a spy who gained the trust of the Trojans by pretending to have deserted the Greeks, then convinced them to take the wooden horse, leading to their downfall. My daughter, when her father was still alive, was set to spy on me. She even wrote about it in her journal. She is a spy. Of course, something that was totally ignored.